those people that work there in their ivory towers. What one specific achievement would you mention to us as something that the CEART has accomplished to help countries or a region to develop their teaching as a profession?
Well, I think we have a lot of things. Some of them are in process and some of them are clearly established. I would just like to give an example, a very small example of Chile. Chile has just passed a new law for teacher professional development. Just, 3 weeks ago, it was signed by the president. In that law, it is established by law, it never had been done, that continuous professional development should be free. And the government has the obligation to offer teachers the possibility to improve, to learn more without having to get money out of their pockets, which happens in many countries.
Thank you. You have convinced me. So what I'm going to do as a task force is to call on you, the CEART members, more often to carry out the message so that countries know that they can use the expertise of the CEART. Now I'm turning to Bill. Bill Rightly, when I know you, each time I see you, you are ILO CEART. You are ILO UNESCO recommendation. And one dimension of the recommendation is what Beatrice has talked about. Jordan mentioned allegations. Can you tell us specifically what these allegations are about?
Thank you. Well, if you wear many hats, then you can always take one of them off and still have one on, or one for exchange. So maybe that's the explanation. I've been asked to speak to you a little bit about a very special procedure that Oliver mentioned earlier, and Jordan as well. And that is the allegations procedures which exist under the mandate of the Joint Committee of Experts. Now, as they have said, it's a unique instrument, it's a unique committee of experts. I don't think it exists anything like it exists anywhere else in our galaxy of international bodies. And early on, when it started working in 1968, it took up the question of how to get information from teachers' organizations, not just governments who were expected to report to the Joint Committee periodically on how they're using them or applying the recommendations. So it adopted this procedure, which it called allegations, and it considered that this is part of its terms of reference to, in effect, promote the application of the recommendation by getting these relevant comments, and therefore to make its reports to ILO and UNESCO member states, which in effect are all member states in the world. They are considered allegations, not complaints, although Oliver mentioned the word complaints, and specifically because, as was said, this recommendation and the 1997 recommendation on higher education adopted by the UNESCO General Conference is not legally binding on any member state. There are, however, conditions under which the information coming from teachers' organizations can be presented to the Joint Committee. One of those is that it must come from a national or international teachers' organization. It's not a mechanism for individual complaints. Secondly, it must not be subject to any other ILO or UNESCO reporting or supervisory procedure, avoiding duplication. Third, it must deal with, it seems obvious, but it's a fundamental condition to make sure that the CEART Joint Committee stays on focus. It must deal with one or more provisions of either of those recommendations. Over the years, the CEART has sought to improve the recommendations and to make this channel of information, if you wish, more accessible and more relevant. It has adopted a procedure very early on that anything coming from the teachers' organizations that smacked in any way of a complaint or an allegation would go to the governments so that they would have a chance to respond. And this allows an opening of a dialogue, which Oliver has mentioned, of a different form to improve communications between governments and the Joint Committee of Experts, and also, by implication, the teachers' organizations. It requires, therefore, a double reporting procedure so that each party, teachers' organizations and governments have 2 reports to make to the CERAD, and therefore can comment on the others' observations. It's established a permanent subcommittee or working party that meets not only during the meetings that Beatrice was saying every 3 years, but even between those meetings by electronic means. And this improves, hopefully, the timely treatment of these organizations' information, because, as many know, at the international level, this can often be very time-consuming and get lost in space, so to speak. So this is a way to do that. And another means by which it has improved its procedures and allowed for more timely treatment of the communications is through the adoption of what it calls interim reports, which may be presented in between the regular 3 yearly meetings. It has extended its mandate to cover the 1997 recommendation, and in recent years there have been a number of cases dealing with higher education. And it has opened up sources of information that are out there but not often considered in parallel. For instance, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education. And it has created an innovative means by which you can actually go directly and discuss with governments and teachers' organizations, called fact-finding or direct contacts mission, and that has been used once so far with regard to a case concerning Japan some years ago. I want to, without getting into specifics of each country or issues, just cite to you the wide diversity of countries that have had cases before the Joint Committee of Experts, and therefore a possibility, not always realized, for dialogue on policy and reforms. Albania, Australia, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Burundi, Cambodia, Colombia, Czechoslovakia, and it was a United States before it split into the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, Denmark, Ethiopia, Haiti, Japan, more than once, Netherlands, Panama, Portugal, Senegal, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and the United Kingdom. A wide diversity of countries and levels of economic and social development. It has dealt with also pretty much the full range of issues affecting teachers and most of the core concerns by extension affecting education, which come out of either of those 2 recommendations, including guiding principles on teaching and educational objectives and policies, notably questions of discrimination against teachers. Social dialogue, as Oliver said, the consultation and participation in development of educational policy is a very important part of the recommendation and therefore of the Joint Committee's careful examination of how that's being applied in member states, and negotiations on teaching conditions. It has dealt with further education, with rights and responsibilities, including professional freedom and autonomy in teaching and curricula, merit performance and assessment criteria and procedures and outcomes, teacher salaries and social security, of course, both levels and coverage, conditions for effective teaching and learning, workload, especially workload, but also questions of teacher-pupil ratios and how that impacts on learning, school buildings. It has dealt with employment and career questions, entry into the teaching profession, the questions of security of tenure, both in higher education and in general education system, and part-time teachers as well. It has dealt with special provisions for teachers in rural and remote areas, a very heavy subject, as we all know, in terms of getting teachers or individuals recruited to be teachers to work in difficult rural and remote areas. Recruitment and employment of unqualified volunteer or contract teachers early on came to the Joint Committee's attention. Higher education reforms also, including academic freedom and research, institutional autonomy and accountability, the tension that exists between those 2, collegiality and governance rights in higher education. So, as you see from that list, and that's not exhaustive, it has really gone to the heart of many of the key issues affecting not only the teaching profession, but education. Has it had results? I would say mixed, partly because it's a procedure that is not very well known or used, partly because it requires a good faith engagement on the part of both teachers' organizations who bring these issues before the Joint Committee, as well as the governments, and particularly the governments. But there has been some success over the years, notably in engaging governments in reforms and actually getting them to change their policies because of recommendations of the Joint Committee. I'm joining now what Beatrice said earlier about, she didn't necessarily cite the Chilean government's change or new policy in relation to SEAC recommendations, but by implication, and I think she's right, the fact that, as she pointed out, there is a recommendation or an article in the 66 recommendation which deals with the issue of free access to continuing professional development. The Chilean government went in that direction as well. And so in cases like the Czech Republic, on workload issues, in cases of Senegal, with regard to contract teachers, although it has not done away with that policy, it has over the years reflected on how to change it and make it a better policy, and in that sense has gone much further in the direction of the recommendations, provisions, and those of the Joint Committee. It has secondly opened up, and very importantly, and I come back to Oliver's comments, a dialogue with teachers' organizations, particularly in places like Australia and Denmark, which brought issues of higher education governance, collegiality, autonomy, professional freedom, etc. In the case of Japan, which had a very sensitive and difficult policy on difficult to apply, in the case of the government, policy on merit, performance, and assessment. And if the SEAC didn't convince the government to actually change that policy, it did cause it to reflect on it, and particularly to open up more channels of communication with the teachers' organizations on how that could be more or better applied. It has, thirdly, I would say, enriched an understanding of policy reforms and major issues facing the teaching profession. So I think indirectly and subtly it has had an impact. It is not the be-all and end-all of international supervisory mechanisms or policy reforms that governments can adopt, but it has, I think, had some impact. In conclusion, I think that it has a place, this little procedure or special procedure, which isn't very well known, it has a place in two important areas. It gives, as I said, a voice, a greater voice for teachers and teachers' organizations at international level to get relevant information to this Joint Committee, notably with respect for the principles of the 1966 recommendation and in the last 20 years, the 1997 recommendation. Secondly, it opens up a dialogue between the Joint Committee and governments and teachers' unions on a way to resolve issues. So it's not just a complaints mechanism, it is a mechanism in which, by engaging in that procedure, governments and teachers' organizations can dialogue with the Joint Committee, seek the richness of its experts on a range of policy issues, and hopefully improve their own policies and practices. It has a twist, of course, in that respect, that it provides an international critique of education systems, particularly which visibly do not comply with the standards of the recommendations, and in some cases don't even seek to do that. So it has those values, and I think it merits further attention on all components.
Thank you for this extensive explanation of the allegation mechanism. One quick question. Can governments or teacher employers also introduce allegation? Because the document is for both parties or three parties.
Normally you wouldn't expect the government to complain about a teachers' organization, although they do all the time, and I'm sure that Dennis will elaborate on that a little bit better than I can. Not really. The governments do their own reporting to to the Joint Committee at the request of the Joint Committee or as they wish, but not in terms of this procedure. Private school employers, for example, could do that. It has never been done, but it is not excluded. It is open to them for that. Yeah.
Thank you. As I said, if you have questions, start putting them down. After the last panelist, we will throw the question and answer session. So the last panelist is Dr. Simone Doctors. One thing in common with Bill is that you have heard about the Teacher Task Force Teacher Policy Development Guide. Both are co-authors of this guide. So they know about policies, and as we said, this document is not well known. The 50th anniversary will help us promote it better so that the parties use it better for social dialogue, for better teacher policies. Simone, can you tell us how the commemoration is going to be organized, and also tell us a little bit what's the link between teacher policy and the recommendations?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? So I think teacher policy is another area where the guide remains extremely relevant and really has a role to play. And I recommend people engaging or beginning to engage with the question of developing a teacher policy to use it. It's a very modern document in many ways, which, in terms of its preoccupations, which really does take account of many of the different dimensions that a teacher policy is going to look at. I was delighted that Beatrice actually shared some of the content of the recommendation with you, because it's a really good read. If you work in these areas, it contains very, very useful, well thought out principles about many of the issues which a teacher policy will engage with. And I did the little experiment of going through the teacher policy guides the other day and comparing what the guide says about the different dimensions and what the 1966 recommendation says. And I can assure you that every one of the 9 dimensions of the teacher policy guide, so the questions of teacher recruitment and retention, teacher education, both initial and continuing, teacher deployment, the question of career structures and paths, questions of teachers' employment and working conditions, reward and remuneration, very important question of teacher accountability, so the rights and the responsibilities of teachers, they're all there. And there are sections which are more embryonic but are nevertheless present on teacher standards and school governance. So all the main themes which we engage with here and which a teacher policy is going to be concerned with are already covered and have very sensible treatment in the 1966 recommendation. And one of the reasons that this is significant for people looking at developing a teacher policy, of course, is because the recommendation has already been adopted. So in terms of advocating for teacher policy, you've got a valuable precedent there. But I think it's also very valuable in terms of the way the different dimensions are covered. So 50 years ago, the recommendation was engaging with the question of how to attract and maintain good quality teachers in rural and remote areas, for example, and with the question of the teacher shortage. So long before the Millennium Goals or EFA or the SDGs, the recommendation was already offering good principles to address these sort of questions. Parts of it can appear old-fashioned, and it's very much a document of its time. So sections, for example, on the women teachers with family responsibilities can now appear very out of date. But I think we have to remember that in 1966, these sections were actually highly progressive, and they reflect the fact that there's a commitment to equity and inclusion at all levels, which is reiterated throughout the document. And so the recommendation specifically talks about the preparation and employment of teachers being free from discrimination on grounds of race, colour, sex, religion or economic condition. And of course today we would add other criteria and other groups such as teachers living with disability, teachers from rural areas, from minority linguistic backgrounds, teachers living with HIV, etc. But I think what's really important is that the principle of inclusion and equity is very clearly there. So it's a very solid basis for a teacher policy to draw on. So just an encouragement really for task force members who are engaging in the process of developing a teacher policy to engage with this very rich document, both as part of their exploratory research and preparation, but also in their efforts to advocate for a teacher policy.
Now, how are we going to celebrate this recommendation?
So there are two proposals on the table, one from the ILO and one from the task force, and I'm in the peculiar position of presenting both of them. So the ILO proposal is for a teaching kit on education and human rights, which will be launched on World Teachers' Day this year, 2016. And the idea is that the teaching kit will enable teachers to teach a unit about education rights, including the rights of teachers, and that this should highlight the continued relevance of the recommendation. So the idea is that the kit will include pedagogical materials, background readings, exercises for activities, some aimed at later primary students, some at secondary students, and the kit initially is going to be produced in 3 languages, the 3 UN languages, and further languages will be added as the project continues. And the idea, I think, is to promote it through social media, via teachers' organisations, through Education International, through the Associated School Network, through the Task Force Network. And the kit, I think, is designed to address topics such as, why do children have to attend school? Is education a right? And if it is, how is it protected? What obligations are created by this right? Is it just a right for children? What does a country need in order to have good teachers? Where do teachers come from? How does one become a teacher? And what does a teacher need to do in order to do a good job of being a teacher? After this meeting, we're going to invite people who'd like to know more about these 2 initiatives to stay behind, and I suspect then Oliver, who's far more informed about this initiative, will be able to give more information about it. The second initiative, and it would be very good, we should have maybe distributed those before, if we could distribute these flyers. The second initiative is a plan by the task force to put together a mobile exhibition of good practices within task force member countries. So the idea is to look at good practices and positive changes in task force countries over the past half-century, and we really want the exhibition to be an inspirational resource to open up new conversations about good practices in the teaching profession, and also identify opportunities for improvement and exchange good practices, because we know that there's a lot of progress to be made. So the idea is that the exhibition will be produced in several examples, so it can be present on World Teachers' Day in different places where World Teachers' Day celebrations are taking place, and then afterwards it can travel around to different sites. So it might go to teacher training colleges, it might go to ministries of education, going to schools, and really help people who wouldn't normally be exposed to this level of discussion to engage with some of these ideas and probably discover what other countries are doing about the problems which everybody identifies with. So the idea is to really start a discussion around some of the issues which are addressed by the 1966 recommendation, but which continue to be preoccupations for teachers and all those working in education today. And I'll give a bit more information if people are interested in contributing, and the idea is that we really want to get contributions from task force members, and particularly from the countries, not necessarily from your own experience, but if task force members can act as an intermediary to transmit to us examples of good practice and examples of stories from your own countries or from your own networks, then we'd really like to receive those. And the flyer which is going round gives some information about how to do that. But rather than talking more about it now, if people who are interested in participating can stay behind at the end of this session, then we can come back to that.